Being and Caring, A Psychology for Living by Victor Daniels and Laurence J. Horowitz, as read by The Happy President. Part 5, Guiding Our Behavior. Chapter 23, Handling Unwanted Behavior. Freud observed some of his patients repeating behaviors that were destructive to their social relationships, their work, and their hopes for happiness. Some observers call this the neurotic paradox. Actually, there is no paradox. Once a way of acting has been learned, it needs only a reward now and then to keep it going. A behavior can be maintained by small, immediate rewards even though larger punishments follow later on. A problem drinker, for example, may drink to dull the anxiety that's hitting now, even though this behavior leads to larger troubles later. Communication theorists Watzlawick, Bevan, and Jackson provide the intriguing observation that while positive feedback in response to acceptable new behaviors usually supports the change, negative feedback in response to unacceptable actions tends to be effective only when unwanted behavior is a momentary disturbance that we want to stop. But negative feedback, which at its extreme shades into punishment, is not much help in making enduring changes. For that, positive feedback is more useful. This chapter addresses both kinds of changes. Using stimulus control to stop unwanted actions. Stimulus control is especially useful for decreasing or ending unwanted behavior. Basically, we avoid exposing ourselves to the events that trigger the unwanted actions. Veronica, who wanted to stop smoking, did 90% of her smoking at the kitchen table while studying, so she started studying in her bedroom and at the library where she didn't smoke. Grace, an obese 18-year-old, used several forms of stimulus control in her weight reduction program. First, she changed her food environment. When she opened the refrigerator, instead of ice cream, she found celery. Second, to reduce snacking, she carried a small plastic plate and utensils in her purse, and when she bought any snack, even a candy bar, she sat down to eat it as if it were a regular meal. Bringing her snacking under the control of the dish and utensils greatly reduced it. Third, when she took seconds, she was asked to divide the portion in half and put half of it back. If she returned for thirds, she was only to take half of the half left from her seconds, and so on. Ultimately, on her own, she began to do that with her first portion, so that even having seconds amounted to only 3/4 of a single helping. Fourth, when others were present, she was to move away and eat alone. Someone who eats more when alone might be asked to eat only with others. She also started counting the number of times she chewed each bite to help herself attend to the taste and texture of the food. In many cases, there's not just one antecedent to an unwanted behavior, but a chain of them. In general, it's easier to interrupt a chain of actions that lead to an unwanted outcome earlier in the chain than later in it. When Ed, who's trying to stop drinking, has stopped at the bar after work to talk to his drinking pals, he has a tough time not drinking. It's a little easier for him to decide not to stop at the bar if he's driving by. But it's easier yet to choose a different route home that doesn't take him past the bar at all. He's interrupting the chain of actions at an earlier point. The problems with punishment. Punishment is a dramatic way to stop unwanted actions. It's popular for two reasons. Often it gets the other person to quit immediately, and it gives you the powerful feeling that comes with control. As a result, the punisher is reinforced and is likely to continue to punish. Nevertheless, there are important problems of effectiveness and long-term results associated with its use. Practical problems. Punishment acts by suppressing behavior, as Skinner's associate William K. Estes showed in 1944. The suppression is often only temporary. At some level, the wish to act in the punished way is still there, but the person is afraid. When the threat of punishment decreases, the behavior returns. An extremely strong punishment may eliminate a behavior permanently, but as we will see, it's likely to have unwanted side effects. Punishment tells a person less about what to do than reward. A person who gets rewarded for something learns what to do to get a reward. A person who gets punished learns only one thing he or she shouldn't do to avoid punishment, and not necessarily what's acceptable. Since behavior that's maintained by the threat of punishment seldom becomes completely voluntary, someone has to keep checking on whether there's any misbehavior. Continuing surveillance is needed. This means that punishment-based control tends to be tiresome, expensive, and difficult to maintain. In contrast, a person whose behavior is influenced through positive reinforcement will offer evidence of successful change. I'll never forget when my father was toilet training one of my little sisters by giving her lots of appreciation every time she pooped the pot. One evening when we had company, my sister suddenly toddled into the middle of the room with a removable potty bowl in her arms and proudly showed us all what she had produced. She got the appreciation she wanted and deserved. How punishment affects us. Effects and side effects. What don't you do because you are afraid to? How much diffuse apprehension do you carry in your body in the form of muscular tenseness? Such present problems are the legacy of past punishments. If, as a child, I was punished when I disagreed with my parents, I learned that I must not talk back. To some degree, I generalized this to all authority. Now, I may be afraid to speak up or contribute to discussions with my boss or other authorities, even when I really need to. A mother or father, angry at a child's crying, sometimes abuses the child and then feels guilty and cuddles or holds the youngster. Pleasure and pain become linked in the child's experience. Loving is good only when it hurts. In the sex violence linkage that is so popular in pornographic literature, movies, and TV shows, we see the sadistic and masochistic behaviors that result from our punitively oriented society. The linkage is so common that in its milder forms, people think of it as normal. To the degree that I've introjected punishment, every time I even think of acting in the punished way, I actually punish myself right then by tensing my body and talking harshly to myself. Fear generalizes easily from one act or situation to another. If I punish someone for a particular act, I don't know for sure what I'm teaching. In her thinking, she may not separate the act from the situation she was punished in and may continue to be at least a little afraid of situations that resemble that one and of the people involved, including me. No one knows how to fully control, measure, and direct the effects of punishment. With positive reinforcement, my predictions about what will happen have a higher probability of being right. With punishment, I can only guess and hope. The punisher and the person punished. The relationship between the punisher and the person punished is potentially toxic. A child who feels punished, for example, may internalize the punishment I give, may learn how to conceal himself or herself, or both. He or she also learns how to punish in return, picking up my ways of punishing and using them to punish me. In this way, he or she can feel some power. This accounts for some of the painful confrontations of teenage years. McIntyre writes about the mother of a teenager who was picked up by the police for vandalism. When asked where her daughter usually went on her nights out, she answered, "Oh, I don't know. She never talks to me." "When was the last time she told you about school or activities with her friends?" she was asked. "I can't even remember," she said. "Oh yes, she told me that one of those bad boys said about her figure, just as if she were proud of having boys think of her that way." When asked what her reaction was, the mother answered with some pride, "Well, I told her if that I ever saw her with that boy again, I'd give her the whipping of her life." What do you suppose the daughter learned from this little exchange with her mother? To leave some boys alone and not talk to them? Or to leave her mother alone and not talk to her? Perhaps I've been afraid of warmth and loving feelings, but now I want to contact you in a more tender, affectionate way. If I've closed you out, I'm going to have a tough time redefining what I want with you. It'll be hard for you to hear me, to believe me if you hear me, and to do anything about it if you hear me and believe me. Out of enlightened self-interest, if I want a relationship of sharing and caring with you, I'll move toward open communication and reward-oriented discipline and away from punishment-oriented discipline. When and how to use punishment. A good rule of thumb is resort to punishment only when you can't think of anything else that might work. Instead of using it casually like aspirin, we'd do better to treat it as a dangerous prescription drug laden with side effects. This is not so easy for those of us who grew up on punishment-oriented discipline. I feel sad at the way I sometimes, before I'm even aware of what I'm doing, lash out when it does no good. Unlearning old habits can be a long, slow process. What we think is punishment may sometimes act as a reward. Temper tantrums are a classic example. Any attention given to a tantrum actually reinforces it. Let the person have the tantrum. Don't pay any special attention during or immediately after it. The tantrums will probably become less frequent and less intense. Suppressing one behavior while strengthening another. Punishment may be needed to help stop an unwanted behavior, as, for instance, when someone is getting hurt or may get hurt. If little Becky runs out in the street in front of cars, I may punish her for it while I teach her to feel good about staying on the curb. This last step, to give positive reinforcement for staying on the curb, is vitally important. When Becky goes out tomorrow afternoon and doesn't run into the street, I'll give her plenty of appreciation for staying on the curb. Of course, I'll also take plenty of time to explain why it's important to stay out of the street. Thus, punishment can serve to suppress one way of acting while a new way is learned. Loss of a positive reinforcer. One kind of punishment that's often effective and that can even have some constructive side effects if it's used in a loving way is withdrawal of a positive reinforcer. I learned from the consequences of my actions. Children face this situation when the toys they've left lying around are put into a locked box for a week or so. Timeout. Timeout is similar but not identical to the old practice of sending someone to sit in the corner. Basically, it's a form of withdrawing positive reinforcement. The child is banished to a place where there is nothing interesting to do. Since kids like continuous activity or stimulation, as little as 2 minutes can be an effective general-purpose punishment. Timeout has two great advantages. It doesn't involve doing anything that might harm the child or cause lasting resentment, and it cools down the situation rather than heating it up if it's used as described here, without fuss or humiliation. The important thing is a clear, immediate response. Remember that the timeout itself is the punishment, though this doesn't preclude talking about the matter after everyone has cooled down. If a child refuses to go into timeout and you end up carrying him or her, be firm and gentle. Such refusals are apt to be rare when your response is to look at your watch and say, "That's 30 seconds more. Will you go in now or shall I add another half minute?" And remember, someone who's in timeout is incommunicado. When you announce that timeout is over, it's over. Carrying grudges is unfair. The length of timeout is proportionate to the offense and the age of the child. With young children, a minute is something that's often enough, and 5 minutes is a uselessly long time. Self-defeating punishment. The forms of punishment with the most unpredictable and unwanted side effects are physical aggression, psychological abuse, and withdrawal of love. Regarding physical aggression, the Balinese have a saying, "Hitting a child damages its tender soul." Violent behavior can be passed on in the family from generation to generation. Psychological abuse, or hitting a person with words or attitudes, involves saying or implying that there is something sick, bad, or defective about the person. A diet of this results in low self-esteem. Withdrawal of love was once widely recommended as a method of punishment. We now know that it can contribute to insecurity in the relationship, the personality, or both. Consistency and warnings. Effective punishment is governed by the rule that a specific unwanted behavior will bring an unwanted consequence. Consistency is critical. Children and adults alike can get along pretty well if they know explicitly which actions will bring punishment and which will be rewarded. Lisa, by contrast, gets chastised for actions she didn't know would lead to punishment. When she does things she's been punished for before, sometimes she's punished and sometimes not. As a result, she's thoroughly confused. There's always a hazard that the underlying reason for punishment is not to change behavior, but to even the score. When used, punishment is appropriately directed toward particular behaviors. This means punishing you when you act in a certain way, not whenever I feel angry. When I'm not in a state of mind to follow that principle, I can tell you, I'm very upset. Please stop what you're doing and give me some space, or I may get nasty. If I want you to respect such signals, I have to be willing to reciprocate, whether you're a child or an adult. Demanding more than I'm willing to give breeds resentment. Wendy and Jeff developed a nonverbal signaling system that worked well for them. Wendy never used to let Jeff finish what he was saying. This was a source of constant irritation, and they were both unhappy about it. They developed a signal. When Jeff put his left hand over his ear, Wendy was to stop talking and listen to him. If she didn't, he was to turn and walk out. It worked. A better way. Extinction. Unwanted ways of acting persist because they continue to be reinforced. Eliminate the reinforcement and these ways of acting cease, or at least decrease in frequency and intensity. Extinction is a preferred method for getting rid of unwanted behavior. Behavioral psychologists David Watson and Roland Tharp write, "In punishment, some unpleasant consequence is added or some pleasant event is taken away following your behavior. In extinction, nothing happens. If a woman said, 'Don't call me anymore, I don't want to talk to you,' that would punish the act of calling. If she simply didn't return calls, that is, she did nothing, that would extinguish the act of calling." Things aren't, of course, always that simple. Watson and Tharp point out that if we withhold the usual reinforcement for an unwanted way of acting, other reinforcers may rush in to fill the gap. They mention a student who was cutting class to shoot pool and play video games in a nearby arcade. He decided to withdraw those reinforcers by going home immediately if he cut class. But when he got home, he listened to a stereo, which he also enjoyed, and kept on cutting class. He needed to find ways to reinforce himself for going to class. Punishment can prevent extinction. Conditions may change so that one of my old behaviors no longer brings rewards. If that way of acting has been suppressed by punishment, I have no chance to learn that I no longer get reinforced for it, so I keep on wanting to act that way. In many cases, extinction can be substituted for punishment. It tends to take a little longer, but once accomplished, it's usually more lasting. When a well-practiced behavior doesn't bring its usual response, the person may get upset and even intensify it, but that's likely to occur only a few times, and then the unwanted response should begin to drop out unless it's also bringing some other reinforcement. Sometimes the reinforcement for an unwanted way of acting is attached to the behavior itself, like the taste sensations that go with eating. Or you may be unable to control others' responses and hence the reinforcement they provide, such as my wife's conciliatory, solicitous response when I stalk out of the house in anger, something I'd prefer to stop doing. When you want to reduce a behavior but can't eliminate the reinforcement, imagined extinction may be useful. The entire process takes place in your mind. Asher and Cotella, for example, counseled an obese man wanted to give up eating an especially tasty and fattening food first to imagine looking forward to eating it with great anticipation, then to imagine eating it, and finally to imagine feeling very disappointed at the taste and flavor. He did this about 15 times each day and successfully eliminated that item from his diet. Similarly, I might imagine my wife responding with cool disinterest when I stalk out of the house. Spontaneous recovery. After extinction has occurred, a person may eventually try out the old behavior again to see if it will work now. This reappearance of old behavior is called spontaneous recovery. The old way may pop up again several times before the person gives it up for good. Sometimes, even when I think a behavior has been totally extinguished, there's one last return to it. I don't need to think that all is lost. This is not a hello again, but a goodbye. Developing alternatives. Extinction works best as one way of acting is being extinguished, an alternative way is being strengthened. Eventually, the event that used to trigger the old way of acting triggers the new, alternative response instead. Otherwise, the extinction process may not work, or if it does, some other unwanted behavior may replace the old one. This strengthening of new behavior works best when the person can't do the old thing while doing the new one. For example, the muscular and glandular activities that go with relaxation and those that go with fear cannot occur at the same time. This procedure is called substituting an incompatible behavior for the old one. Since the new behavior is weak, it should be reinforced every time it occurs and strengthened rapidly while the old behavior is being extinguished. A colleague had a grandmother who constantly complained to all the family about everything. One of the woman's few pleasures was spending time with her family. But since she was so unpleasant to be around, most of her relatives avoided her. Our friend tried an experiment. First, for a time, he recorded how much of her conversation was critical. Then he began ignoring her critical comments and paying attention to her other remarks. Whenever she started complaining, he looked out the window, cleaned his fingernails, and showed his boredom. But when she talked more pleasantly, he was interested, showing that what she was saying was important to him. In time, the griping lessened, and the time they spent together was more satisfying. But the rest of her relatives noticed no change. With them, she continued to complain. So he let them in on what he was doing and asked them to do the same. As she became more pleasant to be around, they spent more time with her. They had decreased her critical, complaining behavior and strengthened more enjoyable behavior to take its place. Contracts for change. I can make the process just described explicit by telling you what I like and don't like, and how I intend to respond to what you do. A contract for change is a useful way to get this kind of explicitness. When I want to change some way you or I act, I can say, I want you to change in this way, and I'm willing to help you by, or I want to change in this way, and you can help me by. Then you reply, accepting, rejecting, or modifying any part of my statement, and we negotiate until we reach an agreement. The first item we negotiate is, do you want to do things differently? If you say, no, I really don't want to, then I make a personal reevaluation. How important is it for me? Perhaps it's more important at some times than at others. I may be able to tolerate your fingers in the peanut butter if we're just hanging out, but really want you to keep them out if we're having company. Our contract also specifies what I give you in return for your changing. A smile, a touch, a word, or maybe that doesn't matter much to you and there's something else you want from me. So we each get something we care about. For instance, you stop wearing my underwear and I stop eating your dog food. End of chapter 23. End of part 5.